long way from St. Louis. You climb the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis. You broke a lot of hearts between.
The summer of 2023 on the wane here. Still got a couple of weeks left, astronomically speaking, but pretty much everybody considers the Labor Day weekend the end of the summer, and we hope it's a good one for you. And we offer news and commentary old school style here on the Narrowcast, as we call it, the radioactive take. I'm Bryan Styble, longtime radio news talker. And thanks for tuning into the Thank Clapton It's Friday edition of the Narrowcast. We say that because back in the 70s, maybe even in the 60s, but certainly in the 70s, it was commonly seen on walls of various places. Clapton is God! So this is the Thank Clapton It's Friday edition of the radioactive take. And let's see what the national conversation is consisting of over the last couple of days. See what everybody's talking about. No, that's not Harry Nilsson. He had the hit with it over the opening credits of Midnight Cowboy. A lot of people's one of their favorite films from the 60s. It once was mine, but every time I've seen it, and I've seen it a dozen times now, I am less impressed with it. But it did win Best Picture, and that song was a hit on the AM radio band, where you find WBQS radio. And we thought we would use that to introduce our news segment here. The hurricane coverage is subsiding, if the floodwaters haven't completely yet. And as that happens, well, the Cold War rhetoric is heating up big time. You see this story about Tucker Carlson? How they're concerned. I don't know if he's concerned. Maybe he ought to be. That one of Putin's assassins will be targeting him in short order. Hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. No comment on that other than to wish good luck to all the parties involved. And out in the Nevada desert, in the northwestern reaches of it at least, Burning Man continues through the weekend. They'll torch the icon to culminate the weekend on Monday, Labor Day, when we'll be, by the way, narrowcasting once again. We're not going to take Monday off. You don't do that in commercial news talk radio, at least not at WBQS. But hope they're having a good time out there. From the footage, it looks like a lot of people are enjoying it. As we've explained on previous editions of the Radioactive Take, that's not my cup of tea. Rock festivals are difficult enough to withstand, but there might be bands playing out there, but the main thing is just all of the wacky goings on, and the dust, and more dust, and just too much dust for my taste. But they seem to like it. The people that pay hundreds of dollars to revel in the desert, and we just hope they have a safe time out there as well as an enjoyable one. So that's the news. I thought we would use this edition of the Radioactive Take to add some context to a tape we are releasing this weekend. My losing appearance on Jeopardy in 1984, specifically on the 2nd of December, 1984. It was a Tuesday, so Tuesdays are usually pretty good days of the week for me. It's my favorite day of the week, but not in December, that first week of 1984. I lost. I was leading for part of the match, but I lost in final, and I really lost when I incorrectly responded to my second daily double. There's 3 daily doubles, as anybody that watches the show knows. 3 daily doubles in every edition of Jeopardy, and I hit 2 of the 3. Did, I thought, pretty well on the first one. That was in the first round, and then probably met my Waterloo, not in final, although I got that wrong too. I did not get the second daily double correct, or even close. And that's too bad, and it's also inexcusable because the clues were there. 50 and Greek, and common to the Christian and Jewish calendars. I should have known that. I wasn't a converted Jew back in those days. That happened in 1999, but I was well steeped in Jewish culture in Los Angeles. Pretty much all my friends were Jewish, and that's one of the reasons I converted later in Chicago in 1999. But no excuse for me missing Pentecost is what I needed to say to Alex Trebek, and I didn't, and that handicapped me or hamstrung me as I went into final, and I lost with that one too. So not a good appearance from my perspective, and that's just one of several reasons I've been sitting on this tape for decades. Showed it to a couple of friends, but not many. I've showed the Challengers tape, which we'll also be releasing as time goes on. There's 5 appearances that I made on the Challengers with Dick Clark, but that was in 1991. And as you might imagine, if I was on there 5 times, I was winning. But I've held on to that tape as well. But there's a certain sense of, if not civic pride, or civic duty, I mean. If not civic duty, there is certainly a sense of cultural duty I have, because there are people, and there's a lot of them, who collect these tapes, these appearances. And you might say, well, who cares about something back in 1984 or even 1991? This is the 21st century. If you're going to care about game or quiz shows, and these were all quiz shows, where you have to know stuff, not just play a game and maybe win. But if you're going to care about any game and or quiz shows, care about ones in the 21st century. This is all history, and why are you dredging it up? Because so many people have been asking me to over the decades. And I know somebody that is acquainted with the game and quiz show tape collecting community. And there's only 3 editions of the Challengers that are on the internet now, just 3. We're going to be adding 5 more, so we'll be more than doubling the number of Challenger extant tapes available to the YouTube viewing audience on a competing channel. Now, there's no shortage of Jeopardy appearances, so you say, what's the need to put Jeopardy on there? Well, because I was on in the first season, and there's a lot of holes. Even Jeopardy's producers don't have, I'm informed, this particular edition taped on the 2nd of December 1984 and then aired. I'm not sure when it aired. It may have been late January 85 or during February, maybe even March, early March of 85. But it was taped on the 2nd of December. And there were several tapings that day. That's the way they do it. I'm sure you realize that. But since Jeopardy doesn't have it and all of the collectors don't have it, I really felt it was just wrong of me to be holding on to both of these tapes. They're all on one or the other of a couple of VHS tapes that were decaying. Maybe it's a good thing I had our associate producer, Sheila Friedman, do the transfer, and that was a gargantuan effort. She spent the whole week doing it between the 1 Jeopardy and the 5 appearances on the Challengers with Dick Clark from 1991. Took her all week. And she was giving me updates, and she was frustrated because it wasn't going well. Because you don't just duplicate the tape. You have to convert it into something that a computer can read, the internet can read, and you have to finalize it and standardize it and stabilize it and things like that. I'm not sure all those I's are in there, but Sheila is, and we're deeply indebted to her for doing all this. And you may be too if you enjoy these. And the Jeopardy one is going up this weekend. I've looked at it one time and was reminded of what a disappointing day that was. But I thought I would explain to you the context, the background of how it was done. The preparation for an appearance on Jeopardy was done, at least back in 1984. I'm sure it's evolved and changed considerably. I've known a couple of other people that were on the show over the years, but I have talked to them, of course, about their appearances, but I never asked them about their experience in the run-up to it. And it's a somewhat involved experience. For me, it took place over 3 separate days, and we'll explain that right now here on the Radioactive Take, but not before I take another sip of coffee before the voice completely goes out on me here. And maybe even a draw of the vape. So, it being the first season, they hadn't worked out all of the procedures, but they did have a telephone number you call. You like to be a contestant? Call this number, local LA number. And about a week after that, they called me back and said, come up to Hollywood and take the test. I was living in Mar Vista on the west side there, district of Los Angeles, just to the west of the San Diego freeway, south of Brentwood and the like. And so I drove up, and there was a possibility I was going to get on that first day. So I followed the instruction. You have to bring a couple of changes of clothes just in case you win, and they don't want you in the same outfit every day. So you got to bring 2 changes of clothes plus what you're wearing. I drove up there, took the test. There were about 30, maybe even 40 people taking the test, but I can tell you exactly how many people, I don't want to say passed the test, but moved on to the next step, and that was 4. There were 4 of us. I was one of 4 out of about 30 or 40. Written test. I don't believe it was multiple choice. I think you had to inscribe answers. You didn't have to put it in the form of a question. They weren't that... and maybe they should have, because they spent a lot of time explaining in the contestant coordinators did, explaining to us how you've got to say what is or where is or who is. And I know they don't enforce it rigorously in the first round, but in the second round they do. If you say, Einstein, Alex, he'll give you a few seconds. And if you don't say, I meant who was Einstein, if you don't add that, he'll say, I'm sorry, if it's the double Jeopardy round. And, yeah, he was the guy behind E equals MC squared, but you didn't phrase it in the form of a question, so you're going to be penalized. That's the way it works. They enforce the rules rigorously in final and pretty much all of the rules. And I fell afoul of that at one point, and that's what we're going to be telling you about in a few moments here. And by the way, they should enforce the rules. One of the rules is you don't leave the company of the so-called standards and practices people. Not only were the Jeopardy staff contestant coordinators briefing us, but accompanying us everywhere, including to the restroom, are so-called standards and practices personnel. And they're not employed by, well, this wasn't a network show. It was in syndication even in 1984, still is. But if it was on a network, all the game shows have it. And this is all an outgrowth of what happened back in the 50s. Quiz show scandal, the Robert Redford movie, you saw it probably. I know the history of that intimately. In fact, I've interviewed briefly one of the central figures in that. That would be the late Jack Barry from 21. I talked to him in between tapings of Jackpot when he was doing that in syndication in the 1980s. So I know the history, and I understand the need for serious surveillance by the standards and practices people. And they were very good at what they did, but they never let you get out of their sight, and rightfully so. So I passed the test along with 3 other people, and we get sequestered in a room for a while. It was a good while. And then they come in and ask us to join a room that had about a dozen, maybe 15 max, people already in there. And these were other small groups that had passed the written test. And it may have been the same written test, may have been different written tests. I don't know. But now I'm in a group of about 15 people or thereabouts. and they start briefing us on the ins and outs of the game, not just answer in the form of a question, but how you're supposed to watch the light that appears to you. Can't see it from the perspective of the camera. The panel lights up, but the light, it is pretty bright, and there's no excuse for not watching it, and I didn't. That's one of the ways I got in trouble. You look at that light, and only then can you answer in. You might think you've successfully buzzed in, but it's a complex system, and there's certainly a rhythm to it, a rhythm that gives an inherent advantage, even back in 1984. And I'm hardly the only one to notice this. The other loser with me that day, we were talking about it on the way out to the parking lot, about how tough it was to get the hang of exactly when to buzz in, because the way they describe it to you, you've got to wait till Alex finishes reading the answer, or the clue as they call it, because on Jeopardy you don't answer the question, you question the answer, as you well know. But they were vague about that. They said when he finishes reading what he's reading off the card. Problem is it when he completely goes silent, or when he's uttering the last syllable and closes his mouth, or is there still another beat? I think there's actually still another beat, but I never got it down. I might have won had I. But the champ, who's been on there 2 or 3 days, or maybe in the case of Ken Jennings, 60 or 70 consecutive editions of Jeopardy, that's a huge advantage. And again, I am not the only one to carp about this. I know it sounds like sour grapes, but this has been written about many times. And Ken Jennings writes about it in a book. He wrote about how to get on Jeopardy. Can't remember the title. I sent the book away to a buddy of mine up in Detroit who's been trying for years to get on Jeopardy. And it's too bad that he hasn't been called, because he'll be a great contestant, I predict, and I think a winner. Anthony in Motown, get on the show and win 75 matches and make people forget Ken Jennings, which would be pretty tough to do since he's the host of the show nowadays. And that's a good thing, as Martha Stewart might say. We've pointed out on previous editions of the Radioactive Take that when they finally settled on him, and it was a long process that led to his being selected as the permanent host of Jeopardy. When he survived that process, that was a triumph for meritocracy, because he is the best. And I don't mean the best contestant. He clearly, with 74 wins, was the most consistent winning contestant. But I'm talking about his learning curve was not that long when he started out as a host. Well, he had done a lot of other quiz shows in the wake of his several years. More than that, it was back in the early years of the century that he had his run, and then he was on a lot of other quiz shows and talk shows and all the rest. And why not? You would expect that. And he learned how to operate on camera, something maybe after a couple of years of doing this narrowcast I will learn. But he learned rather quickly and got the gig, and is consistently the best host I've ever heard. He's better than Trebek was. I'm even going to go out on a limb here and say I think Jennings is a better host for Jeopardy than even Art Fleming was. And I never thought I'd say that, because I thought Art Fleming was decidedly superior in his approach, his gentlemanly approach to the job. And it's a difficult job. Savannah Guthrie talked about that at length when she did it for a week or two. She talked on the Today Show in the aftermath how it's nothing like this show. On this show, we make mistakes all the time and you just go to commercial on the Today Show. But on Jeopardy, you can't do that, because it's a competition that has very specific rules and a panel of judges that enforce those rules more than rigorously in an ironclad fashion. And again, this is a good thing, not a bad thing. I'm not complaining about any of that, although some people have. And I'm not even really complaining about the buzzer thing, except it's an advantage for the champ. Or at least that's my opinion and the thinking of a lot of other people who have written about this over the decades. So So anyway, we have a run through. Once the three people that passed the test with me join this other group, we've got a couple of contestant coordinators. They're associate producers. One guy's got his leg, he's sitting on the table and he's got his legs hanging over, and he tells us, now we've got a new rule with the new Jeopardy. Back in the days, and it wasn't that much previous, 15 years or so, that the old Jeopardy was still on, because Art Fleming continued to do it into the 70s. It was called Super Jeopardy then, but it was still more or less the same thing in syndication as the network show on NBC was all those years through the mid and late 60s. And this contestant coordinator with his legs hanging over the table there said, now, a lot of people don't like this new rule, because on the old Art Fleming show, the second and third place contestants, they would be able to keep whatever money they accrued after final. But no more. Now you collect your money if you win, but if you're second or third place, it's a consolation prize. And in my case, it wasn't even a very good one. Looked nice on the camera there. You'll see it on the tape. They have a picture of it, but the picture is, well, it led me to believe it was a nice prize, and I'm into fitness, so yeah, great. But when it arrived, it was already broken. It never worked right, and even when it was more or less working as it was supposed to, it still was a lousy exercycle. Threw it away. Eventually, it wasn't even easy to throw away because, it weighed a lot and took up a lot of space in the Mar Vista apartment there. That I would have rather had no consolation prize, frankly. I certainly would have rather had the money I accrued. Unfortunately, in my case, it was just $10. After final, I was down to, I think, 10, something like that. So the contestant coordinator with his legs hanging over the desk. And this is a nice guy. His name is Mark. And I would see him later. It's part of the story. He's given us all the ins and outs, what we should do, and more important, what we shouldn't do. And then after that practice session with, we didn't even have buzzers. We had, I think they were those little ding bells. Ding, ding. And although that may have been on the challengers, or it might have been on both, I don't remember. But there were no buzzers in the, or signaling devices, as they're technically known to the Jeopardy producers. We didn't have those in the informal session. But then soon enough, they trundled us over to the studio. And this is all at it's a compound surrounding the studios of KTLA, Channel 5 in Los Angeles. If you ever lived in LA in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, I got there in June of 1980, and it didn't take me more than a week in town to find that Hal Fishman, the Walter Cronkite of Channel 5, was my favorite anchor in town. He was better than the network affiliates, KABC, KNX-TV, that's CBS, and KNBC, of course, NBC, over there in Burbank. Beautiful downtown Burbank. It's actually about 3 or 4 miles south of downtown Burbank. Laugh-In got it wrong, but they did get a national catchphrase into the American conversation with that beautiful downtown Burbank thing. But we're in Hollywood here, the District of Los Angeles known as Hollywood. We're on Sunset Boulevard, not the Sunset Strip, mind you. That's considerably to the west, and it's actually in West Hollywood, a separate little city. But in Los Angeles, the District of Hollywood includes this block of Sunset Boulevard, which is not called the Strip, but all kinds of showbiz stuff is there. And in fact, right next door is the Aquarius Theater on the south side here of Sunset, just to the west of the Hollywood freeway. The Aquarius Theater is where one of my favorite movies, which I haven't seen in 30 years. I'd like to see it again, but it never comes up, to my knowledge, on TCM. I'm talking about Zoot Suit with Tyne Daly, a young and slender Tyne Daly, and James Olmos. When I met James Olmos in Chicago at WGN Television, I was working as a writer there, morning news at WGN in Chicago. I met him in the lobby and talked to him for a couple of minutes. I didn't have any time to do anything other than shake his hand, tell him I admired him, and how great he was as, I think the character was called a gaucho. He didn't have a name, but he's this almost supernatural character. And normally I don't go for ghosts or telepathy or anything like that, or even science fiction. I'm a science fact kind of guy. But for some reason in this film, I thought it worked beautifully, this mysterious, ethereal character almost that he played. And I did talk to Olmos about that. That was shot there. It was, and another interesting thing about Zoot Suit is it's a movie that is actually a filmed play. Now, there's a lot of plays that become movies. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about it was a play, and it was at the Aquarius Theater, and they went in and shot it on 35 millimeter film, I guess, maybe 70 millimeter Panavision, who knows? But Zoot Suit is a filmed play, and Olmos was great in it, and so was Tyne Daly, and that was right next door to the studios and the other buildings in the complex that surround KTLA. That's where this was taking place. Nowadays, they do it down in Culver City, which is about 15 miles to the southwest, at what I still call MGM. It's gone through various names, but it's where they shot Gone with the Wind, and it will forever be known as MGM to me, no matter what the current name is. I think it's Sony, but that's where Jeopardy is nowadays, right next door in that back lot to where Pat and Vanna do Wheel of Fortune. But back in 1984, Jeopardy was in an adjacent studio to the People's Court. Now, I didn't see Judge Wapner, the late Judge Wapner, but I did see the late bailiff, Rusty Burrell. Met him, shook his hand during one of the breaks. They were in the hallway there. So we were just one studio away, but I'm getting ahead of myself here because we had that little practice thing with the bells, dinging the bells. Then they lead us over to the studio, and I can't remember if I met Rusty Burrell that day or a week or two later when I came up for the second of my 3 trips to Hollywood for this. And I do know that the first one, and this was well before December 2nd, don't know the date of this one in 1984, but it's at least a couple of weeks because I'm still at my in my first visit there. My 2 changes of clothing are still hanging with everybody else in the contestant pool, hanging on the rack there. And I'm wondering, am I going to get on today? I might have, but not before we had a practice thing. And this time we're actually on the set, and we're behind the 3 lecterns. And they're showing us how to use the stylus, the electronic stylus that I used my left hand for. You'd probably be doing it with your right hand, but everybody gets a chance to do it because it's not exactly tricky, but they want to make sure that it works when you get on camera if you're selected. And nobody at this point is guaranteed of getting on, but we were in the contestant pool. And they give us a dummy clue, but before that, we write our wagers as if we're doing Final Jeopardy. That's the only time they do the electronic stylus thing. And they ask us to make a $1 wager. And originally, I wrote $0 with a $sign. And then I did something I'd seen on the air, on the Trebek version, and many times back in the Art Fleming black and white era. I had seen contestants cross out their initial wager and write a different one. And that's what I did. Why did I do that? Because I didn't want to tip off that to the contestant pool that was my planned strategy going into an actual match that I happened to be on, if I got on. So I crossed it out and wrote $1,000 or $2,000 or something like that. And that turned out to be a major error on my part, although I didn't realize it at the time. So we did that. Everybody gets a chance at the buzzer. And then since there were about 15 or 18 of us, there were 5 or 6 sets of people testing the equipment or getting the hang of the equipment, at least getting a try at the equipment. You don't get the hang of it until you're on the air, and even then you don't get the hang of the buzzer system. because it's an inherent advantage for the champ because it takes a while. And the guy who lost with me, Tom from North Carolina, you'll see him on the right. He was to my left. He's behind the far right lectern. And we were walking out to the parking lot there after signing our release papers, and we were agreeing that it's tricky. And the champ had already won a match. He was in his second match, as I recall, so he had a lot more experience with that buzzer. And the trick is, when do you buzz? Whether he's finished or whether he's paused. I mean, it's just not easy. But, again, that sounds like sour grapes. But that wasn't the kind of guy Tom was. Tom from North Carolina was a real, genuine, nice guy. I got to know him during the time before I got on. And again, this was much later. This was on the 2nd of December. We're still in my first match there, or my first session. And I sat through 5 tapings, didn't get on. But after 3 tapings, they'd break for dinner. And there's always at least a half hour between tapings. So this is an all afternoon and into the evening affair. And about dinner time, I guess. But after 3 tapings, they take us to a good-sized conference room, and there's a catering outfit that's getting ready to feed us. And there's a long line of people lined up. And something went wrong with the catering outfit. Once we got the food, it was fine and dandy, very good. And you might expect that. I mean, this is a big money operation, even in its first season of syndication. But for some reason, all of the silver trays or aluminum trays, steel trays, I guess, that the caterers had laid out were still empty. And this went on for quite a few minutes. And the line is quite long. I'm about 20 people back in the line, and there's another 20 or so behind me, because it wasn't just the contestants, it was the production people and all the rest, including Trebek, who, by utter coincidence, happened to be right in front of me in the line. So I got that 10 minutes. I had the opportunity to talk to him. And he was also talking to the woman up in front of him, directly in front of him, but he was going back and forth between them, and I was certainly going to take advantage of this chance to engage him in a context other than on the sound stage. So I was talking to him. I was talking to him about my interest in game shows in particular and quiz shows. I should say game shows in general and quiz shows in particular, and also gave him a list of my favorite hosts. And he was on that list, and rightfully so. So was Richard Dawson and a couple others. So that was fun, getting to know him a little bit. And he was a tall guy, so I was looking up. I was 5'11" in those days, about 5'10", maybe even down to 5'9", shrinking as we speak here on WBQS News Talk Radio. So I was looking up at him, and I've always looked up to him. I thought he was a terrific host. He was no Art Fleming, but nobody else was. Well, maybe Pat Sajak. Pat Sajak's every bit the gentleman that Art Fleming was, and I think, well, we've talked about him here on previous editions of the Radioactive Take. I think what he's done on Wheel of Fortune with Vanna is the sterling standard for game or quiz show hosting. And I wish I would have seen that time. One time for April Fool's Day, they fooled the Jeopardy and Wheel contestants by having Sajak come out and do the full hour on Jeopardy, and Trebek did Wheel of Fortune. So I wish I would have seen either of those. But I was there, went back after dinner, sat through two more tapings, and then they say, so long, we may call you again. Okay. They don't tell you they're going to call you, and they don't tell you they're not going to call you. They just leave you hanging. But about a week later, maybe 2, I got another call. Come on back. And this time there were only going to be 2 tapings, but I still had to carry I guess this time only 1 change of clothes, because if I were to win, if I was on the first of those 2 tapings and I won, I'd need a second change of clothes. But I didn't have to take 2 additional wardrobes. But I didn't get on that second week, and I didn't feel bad about it, and I certainly didn't realize what a predicament I was in. I would only find that out later and they said the same thing. We may call you again. We may not. Good luck to you. So I went back to Mar Vista over on the west side of Los Angeles, and I did get a third call. And I would soon enough find out that that third call almost didn't happen. Because I drove up to Hollywood again, and as I told you, the KTLA studios are on the south side of Sunset Boulevard, just to the west of the Hollywood freeway. If you've visited on vacation, and so many people do, to Hollywood, not just Los Angeles, but if you get up to Hollywood, and who wouldn't go to Hollywood if you're in L.A., if you're a tourist? You've been at this intersection, Sunset and I don't know if it's Vine or it might be Prospect or something. I don't know. But it's just to the west of the Hollywood freeway on the south side of Sunset Boulevard, the KTLA studio complex is. But they had us park in this real small, it was on an almost empty lot. It wasn't that small. But when I got there, there were only 2 people in the parking lot. I don't know where the other contestants were parking on this third time I was called. There for the third time, and the parking lot was all but empty. There was one other human in it, and boy, am I glad I ran into him. Turned out to be Mark. Don't know his last name, but he was well steeped in the game show thing because he would show up later on an obscure game show on an obscure cable network that came out of Nashville, of all places. Not a hotbed of game show production, but that's where that one was. And this time he was the host, Mark, whatever his last name was. I used to know it, but forgot it over the last 30 years. And nice guy. I wasn't happy when he was, and he was almost being snarky when he said, well, a lot of people don't like this new rule. We don't give any money to the losers, but that's our rule, and we're sticking to it. I thought that was a little snarky, but he was nothing but warm when I ran into him in the parking lot. And I got a change of clothes over my shoulder there, and we're walking, and this good block, maybe even a block and a half to the west. So we have to walk on the north sidewalk of Sunset, and then we have to wait at a light, and it's a major intersection, again, that you've visited, or you've been on through if you've visited L.A., and we wait for the light, and I'm talking to him the whole time, and he's making it pretty clear that he's doing me a favor, and he did. This is what he told me. It started telling me this in the lot, and it shocked me. Maybe it shouldn't have, but he said, look, good to see you again, Bryan. He remembered my name, and I'm not surprised. He was the contestant coordinator, and he had seen me 2 previous times. And I may even have talked to him during that first session weeks earlier. Says, Bryan, good to see you again, and good luck on getting on the show today. But I want you to know, you better toe the line here, because you're not getting on if you don't get on today. You'll never get on. In fact, I'm a little surprised that they called you back for the third one here. But they didn't like it at all when you changed that bet in the trial run behind the lectern. He may have called it a podium, but he's wrong. If he did, it's a lectern. Ken Jennings still calls them podia, but it's not a podium, it's a lectern. We've covered that on a previous edition of the Radioactive Take. But he says, well, when you were behind that lectern, you shouldn't have done that. They didn't like that. Just follow all the rules, and maybe you'll get on today. But if you don't today, it's all over for you. Keep that in mind. And I did. And soon enough, I got on the air. I was on the first of the 2. I think there was just 2 tapings. I'm not sure about the third time. I know the second time there were 2 tapings, and the third time there may have been more. But I only went through one of them because I was on that first one as a challenger to this fellow, Jack Friend. And I lost, so hit the road. You got to sign a couple of papers, but this is not an exaggeration. It sounds like an exaggeration, but they usher you out so fast, the losers, that there wasn't more than about 90, maybe 100 seconds, not 2 minutes, between when I left the lectern. Well, actually, I was up at Trebek's lectern because in the old days, before COVID, we'd all cluster around the host up by his lectern. at the end of the show for the shot. But as soon as the red light went out, I was ushered rather rapidly, I would even say, to a table where I had to sign 2 releases. So did Tom from North Carolina, the other defeated challenger. And we signed 2. I didn't read it, didn't have time because they were ushering us out to the parking lot. And that's when I had a chance to talk to Tom, as I told you. So it's real quick there. It's different when you win. When I was winning on the challengers, well, we'll tell you about that when the challengers tapes come out soon. But losers are pretty much treated like losers on Jeopardy, or at least they were in December of 1984. But I got on that match, that first match that was taped that third time I was there for the proceedings. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. In fact, you can't even go through the whole thing because the entirety of the edition of Jeopardy, taped the 2nd of December 1984, a Tuesday, the entirety of it wasn't on my tape. The first segment before the interviews was on another tape. The tape ran out when I was taping it off the air in January, February, or March, whenever it aired. Not sure of the air date, but I know the taping date. It's in my archives, and it's a date which will live in my personal infamy forever, to borrow FDR's most famous quote. So one of his most famous, only thing we got to fear, that's probably even more famous, but most infamous in my quiz show history was losing on Jeopardy. So, but I've gotten over it, although these feelings are resurfacing as I watched it the other night. Well, anyway, there was one bright spot. I hit 2 of the 3 daily doubles. You get 3 daily doubles. The whole shebang has 3 daily doubles per match, 2 in the second round, 1 in the first. I hit the 1 in the first, and I hit 1 of the 2 in the second. The one I hit in the second, I have no excuse for missing. Should have known it. All the clues were there, common to the Christian and Protestant calendars, Protestant calendars. It was Pentecost, but it was 50. I was supposed to know the time or the number 50. Greek. Trebek said it was a Greek derivation of the name of this holiday. It was under holidays, the category. And all the clues were there, all the information I needed to say, what is Pentecost, Alex? And that would have changed things maybe a lot. I might have won the match. But I lost that, and that was right before we went into final. But in the first match, or in the first round, regular Jeopardy, I hit a question about a clue. Because on Jeopardy, you don't answer the question, you question the answer. And the answer that he provided to me was, and just to me alone, when you're on Daily Double there, you don't have to worry about buzzing in. And you get a couple, 3 extra seconds to respond. And he told me it was Dobie Gillis. He called it Dobie Gillis. It was actually called The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. And it had to do with an actor who got, I don't know if it was his start, but an early role for a big-time movie actor was Wilton Armitage. Wilton Armitage was the character's name on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. And I had to go through my head. I didn't know it when he presented it to me. I had to think. It's certainly not Maynard G. Krebs. He wasn't a recurring character anyway. He was a regular character. And it wasn't... I actually thought it might be Tuesday Weld, because she was a recurring character, but she was a woman, or a girl at least. And this was a male actor, or at least that's the way Trebek phrased it. So I had to think, and I had to think quickly, and I managed to get it. Warren Beatty. Who was Warren Beatty was the correct response, and that felt good. But it soon went south for me in Double Jeopardy again by blowing the second Double Jeopardy, and then also blowing the final Jeopardy, which you can watch and decide for yourself whether I should have known that. So that's how it went on Jeopardy. And what can I say other than I'm letting this out so that people that really care about these quiz shows and game shows in their collections and getting every possible extant tape that's out there. I'm doing it for them. And I'm also doing it for you, the Radioactive Take audience. I hope you'll enjoy it. And I hope you'll be here on Monday when we reconvene for the Labor Day edition. We're not taking Labor Day off. We shall be laboring behind the WBQS News Talk microphone on Labor Day, Monday night, for another 5 editions over the week of the Radioactive Take. We might remind you that email comes to radioactiveseattle@gmail.com. And that's the long and the short of it. And I'm afraid it's too long of an edition of the narrowcast, but that's the way it went this time. We'll try to be more succinct next time. Enjoy my defeat on Jeopardy, and we offer you a Labor Day weekend left-handed salute from Florida.